Hi, welcome to the 5th Masterworks concert of the season. The theme is Wolfgang and Wine. So there's a pre-concert wine tasting, and of course, the concert will feature the music of Mozart as the main course, if you would, for this particular program. As maybe you can tell, I am sitting here in one of the studios here at the South Carolina Public Radio. Thanks to them for providing this facility for us today to record this pre-concert talk. So there are 3 pieces on the program. The main piece in the second half of the program is the famous Requiem, his final and incomplete work, of course, by Mozart. And then in the first half, we have 2 works that are the shorter works. In the first half, they are both in their own way connected to the Mozart. So at the beginning of the concert, we are playing a recent work by a Mexican composer, Gabriela Ortiz, and it's called La Calaca, which means the skeleton. And that piece for string orchestra is quite a vibrant and exciting piece, but deals with the theme of death. So that has something in connection there with the Mozart. And in between the 2, you will hear this virtuosic Horn Concerto No. 1 by Richard Strauss, one of his early works that he wrote when he was 18 years old for his father, who was a famous horn virtuoso of the day. And even though, of course, the early Strauss works, they're still romantic in quality. Strauss immediately was very much a fan, admirer of Mozart's music. His long career sort of starts with earlier works like this Horn Concerto that is sort of modeled after sort of the spirit, if you would, of Mozart's music. And of course goes on to write all these extravagant pieces like Don Juan, which we played last year, Salome Rosenkavalier, all of these pieces. And then at the end of his life, he returns to sort of his roots. So the very late works by Strauss will also have more of a restrained classical spirit that sort of like harkens back to the music of Mozart. So Strauss and Mozart, so it's always, I feel, that's a great pairing. And then of course we have Ortiz and Mozart that is connected by sort of 2 different views, if you would, of death. So that's the whole program. Of course, we will start by discussing a little bit about the Mozart Requiem, which occupies the second half of the concert. And for many of you out there, you probably have seen the film Amadeus or seen the play, the original play Amadeus, that inspired the film, of course. And in that story, so some of you probably remember that this image of Mozart sort of on his final days, trying to finish his Requiem, and he's dictating it to his quote, rival, Antonio Salieri. Of course, it's insinuated that he actually poisoned Mozart and, all of these things. So, of course, that's fiction there. But the reality also is that he was trying to dictate in his final days, trying to finish this Requiem. And so he had his students, composition students, his pupils, sitting around the room, and he was dictating trying to finish up, so he was dictating some of the choral parts, vocal parts to his students. Constanza, his wife, later recounted that, including Constanza, several people were in his room in those final days, and he wanted everybody to sort of sing through some of the parts of the Requiem so he can hear it and revise sort of as necessary. And of course the final work, final result, he passed away before he was able to complete this piece. As a matter of fact, he had only really finished the very first section, which is the introit, and he had finished the choral part, he had finished the orchestration for that movement. And then the ensuing Kyrie section was mostly finished, but I don't think it was completely finished as far as the orchestration was concerned. And then the rest of the sections up until famously eighth measure of the section called Lacrimosa, he had left basically sort of a bare bone sketches. In a lot of the times the vocal parts, and then with some of the figure bass, so that we know what harmony he wanted. Here, some rough sketches as to orchestration, what kind of figures he wanted, which instruments to play. So they were not complete, but he had left many of those fragments. And then the rest of the Requiem was actually left unfinished, even though it is recounted that he left some detailed instructions, probably realizing that he didn't have enough time left with his declining health to actually finish it himself. He was talking to one of his students by the name of Süssmayr to sort of how to go about finishing the rest of the Requiem. And the version that you have probably heard, and that this was the version that was most often performed for many decades, since its composition, was the completion by Süssmayr. And Süssmayr was, I think, at the time of Mozart's death, he was 25 years old, so very young composer. He also did leave some of his own compositions. Can you imagine, however, I mean, being tasked with completing Mozart's final masterpiece? And so you could just imagine the pressure, and and we could kind of glean, it's not really a definitive view, but we could kind of glean into his sort of struggles, trying to reconcile with the fact that he's tasked with completing this thing. For instance, Süssmayr claimed that he was basically he used everything that was given to him by Mozart. But then it was, I think, as recent as during the 1960s, there resurfaced these a pretty detailed sketch of a fugue, commonly known the Amen fugue, that was actually the section that was to follow right after Lacrimosa, in Mozart's hand. They consulted the handwriting expert, I suppose, and it's definitely in Mozart's hand. That was the musicologists, researchers concluded that was intended to be included in this Requiem, but Süssmayr didn't use it. So is it that some people think maybe he wasn't confident enough? Süssmayr was not confident enough to make the full use of that particular material, and so on. There have been other completions of the Requiem, and the version you're going to hear at this concert is actually a more recent completion based on the Süssmayr completion by an American musicologist, Robert Levin. And what Levin did was he went through and Süssmayr's completions, even though it has obviously become such a staple repertoire, this was the version that was, for instance, the Mozart Requiem in Süssmayr completion was performed at the memorial service funerals for other composers like Haydn, Beethoven, Chopin, even Napoleon. Had at least parts of the Mozart Requiem performed, so it's definitely has become one of the most performed choral orchestral works. But Süssmayr, essentially, when we look at the Süssmayr completion, there are some sections that people feel are maybe too heavy-handed in terms of how thickly it's orchestrated for orchestra while the chorus is singing. There are some technical things that people have always considered a little bit sloppy, as in it's something that Mozart would not have done based on his other works, his late works. works like the Magic Flute, the Clemenza, the Tito, or the Clarinet Concerto, sort of his final pieces leading up to this Requiem. And they compare and they said, this doesn't make sense because the way the one note lead to another, we call this voice leading, it just doesn't seem correct. But that's, it's sort of it's sometimes it's sort of a knock against Süssmayr. And, the people say, well, comparing to Süssmayr's works, people say, well, obviously Süssmayr, especially compared to Mozart, was not as gifted, original as a composer. So it's sort of, Süssmayr gets a little bit of a bad reputation a little bit. But so what Levin did was he went back to the Süssmayr compilation, but he basically kind of cleaned it up a little bit, and then inserted this whole Amen fugue. Is now prominently used in this version of the Requiem. So that's the version we are going to be performing, and I'm very much looking forward to kind of digging into this Robert Levin completion of this. Another thing about this, I think in the movie also, in Amadeus, there's this mysterious visitor who comes to visit Mozart and commissions the Requiem. That part actually, the mysterious nature of this commission, why he came to write this Requiem, is actually that mysterious bit is true. It was sort of anonymous commission, and but Mozart couldn't turn it down because, as we know, he was always, he seemed to always have had some kind of financial difficulty, so he was sort of living from commission to commission, sort of, paycheck to paycheck, but sort of commission to commission sort of thing. So there was a very lucrative offer this anonymous commissioner gave, or sort of the representative for this commissioner who got in contact with Mozart gave, and half of the commission fee was going to be paid up front upon the acceptance of this commission. So of course Mozart felt the urge, the need really to take this thing on, even though he was so busy in his final, the summer into the fall months of 1791, his final year. He was just extremely busy conducting the premieres, finishing and conducting the premieres of these aforementioned operas like the Magic Flute, writing other works like Clarinet Concerto, but he really wanted to finish this Requiem. Well, it turned out the commission, we think, was actually, it came from not anonymous commissioner. The anonymous commissioner had a name, and he was Count Franz Walsegg. And apparently, it was nothing, in some sources you'll read that, well, because Walsegg's intent was to commission a work from Mozart, in this case, of course, and then upon the completion of it, when they perform it, he was going to pass it off as his own work. It sounds very nefarious, of course, but the story goes that actually he did it sort of as a guessing game, is in a way. So they will perform whatever he secretly commissioned, and publicly sort of it's considered Count Walsegg himself wrote this, but then he will come out and say, well, actually, guess who do you think actually wrote this? So it was sort of a guessing game, and of course, through the process of this, there's the real composer obviously gets acknowledged. And so, we think that was sort of the intent for this commission. But of course, Mozart was, there's the, and we don't know like how much of the accounts by his widow Constanza, for instance, or by people like his Süssmayr, like his students, people who were close to Mozart during this time. We don't know how much of this is really accurate and how much of it's a little bit exaggerated or so. But Constanza recounts that Mozart became obsessed with writing this Requiem and trying to finish it. So he would, obviously in declining health, obviously just not having enough time to sleep, not having enough time to take care of his own body, he would still insist on working on the Requiem into the early hours of the morning, to the point where she felt that it was actually affecting his health in a negative way. So she claimed that she actually had to take it away from him for a few days, just so that it wasn't, so he wasn't obsessed about trying to finish this piece. But in any case, this is of course one of the greatest works by any composer, but it's the final work by Mozart, and then as being a mass for the dead, as being the Requiem. He had written many works, like several other masses, works for the church, and so on, earlier in his career. So since he moved to Vienna in 1781, the last 10 years of his life, he hadn't really had a chance to revisit that genre during that time. So here he is having a chance to revisit that genre that he was very successful in pre-Vienna days, and unfortunately not being able to finish it. But you will hear the completed version by Süssmayr and then Robert Levin at these concerts. To open the concert, I mentioned that it's connected with a theme of death. And so this is a piece by contemporary Mexican composer, Gabriela Ortiz. And at the time of this filming, a few days before this, Carnegie Hall announced their upcoming season for the 2024-25 season, which has a very strong Mexico and Latin American theme to it, with Gustavo Dudamel serving as sort of the creative chair for a feature throughout the season. And Ortiz is actually going to be composer in residence for the Carnegie Hall for the upcoming season. So they'll be playing various ensembles who'll be featuring her works throughout the season at Carnegie next year. But she's been quite active. She grew up in Mexico City, and both of her parents were famous folk musicians in Mexico, played in this sort of a very famous folk band in Mexico City. So she grew up with the sound of traditional Mexican music, and so she was sort of a natural course for her to pursue the career in music, and of course become a composer. She teaches in Mexico City. Also has taught some part-time at the Indiana University in Bloomington, and has written. She's quite prolific. She's written many works for chamber ensembles. She has written a couple operas, of course, many pieces for orchestra. The piece that you're going to hear is, as I mentioned earlier, it's called La Calaca, or means the skeleton. And it's, if you imagine, if you're familiar with like the images associated with the Day of the Dead in a tradition in Mexico, it's the very vivid figurines with the skeleton. That's basically what La Calaca is. And she talks in depth in her program notes for this piece about the concept of death in Mexican tradition. And she says because she says that the Mexican culture really stems from, there are obviously two big influences. One is sort of the Hispanic influence, sort of the European, mainly Spanish influences, and combined with the sort of the pre-Hispanic times or traditions. So even when it comes to things like death, and in Mozart Requiem, we're now talking about very obviously traditionally European Catholic tradition of Mass for the Dead. And in this piece by Ortiz, it's sort of a death, but she says she feels that in Mexico, she says, culturally speaking, she says death is really like everywhere. She says people are just obsessed with death in their music, in their plays, in their fiestas, in their dance, all of these things. But they view, so the Day of the Dead, which is traditionally November 1st and 2nd, is really a way to sort of celebrate one's life. She almost calls it the birthday for the dead. And she says there are two different things that happen. There is sort of the fiesta with music and dancing and burning of the incense that happens sort of more of a public celebration of life of the deceased family members and relatives at the cemetery, at the gravesite. But then in each home they would have these altars. And I always kind of look back to my childhood in Japan, because our equivalent in Japan was in the middle of the summer. It's like August 13th through the 15th, and sort of that's an equivalent holiday almost as Thanksgiving here, where people go home to their hometowns to visit family. So it's like midsummer and also New Year's. That's sort of our Thanksgiving and Christmas in a way. But the house I grew up in, there was a shrine. There was a little altar. Although we had there was an actual cemetery too, but we had a little altar in the house where we would put flowers every day, or put the favorite snacks, like my grandpa's favorite snack we will put up, for or sake or something, right? That's a very popular thing you might see in altars or in cemeteries there. So in Mexico too, they kind of celebrate one's life through dancing and music and so on. And then, so what Ortiz did was she wrote this piece. Was originally one of the movements that she wrote for the Kronos Quartet. It was like a 4-movement work, and the whole it was all built around the theme of the altar for the dead. And the La Calaca was the final movement, sort of this exuberant ending to this suite. And then she later, actually only a couple years ago, she expanded this piece for string quartet to a full string orchestra, and that is the version we'll be playing for you at this concert. It's just quite, it ends with this such a joyous and exuberant dance at the end. It's a 8-minute, 9-minute journey that goes through various moves, but mostly celebratory and very rhythmic, kind of homage, like a homage, if you would, to the dead. So that's what opens the concert, and then in between we'll be featuring our principal horn player Ken Turner. In the incredibly virtuosic and heroic Horn Concerto No. 1 by Richard Strauss. So as I mentioned earlier, his father, Franz Strauss, was a longtime principal horn player of one of the major orchestras in Munich, and he was known for his virtuosity. Also, he was known for his sort of conservative musical taste, in a way. So there's a famous anecdote with Strauss's father. He had played many operas by Richard Wagner, and obviously incredibly well. And Wagner has such high regard for Franz Strauss and his ability as a horn player, but personally, they just couldn't stand each other, because Franz Strauss was a very much more of a conservative, more in the mold of Brahms, let's say. His music to him, Wagner's music was too much, as people might say, and Wagner knew this. Wagner knew, Franz Strauss can't stand me, and I don't particularly care for him either. But boy, he plays my music so well. So there's like sort of a interesting professional respect there. And of course, Richard Strauss would later on become sort of follows more in the mold of Wagner. We don't quite know how his father sort of took that when he started writing pieces like Don Juan and Till and Spiegel and Salome and all these things. But at 18-year-old Strauss here, he was actually studying philosophy at the university in Munich. But because he grew up with the sound of horn since his childhood, he had already written a couple of things, a couple little pieces for horn. But this here, he decided to sort of write a full-scale concerto for the horn. There are actually 2 horn concertos. This is the first one, which is more often performed, that we'll be sharing with you at this concert. Towards the end of his life, he actually writes the second horn concerto. He says he wanted to sort of go back to his roots a little bit and kind of revisit some of the things, some of the same genres he did earlier in his career. So horn concerto was one of them. So there's a second horn concerto, which is even more virtuosic than the first concerto that you're going to hear. It's in 3 short movements. Similar to like the violin concerto by Mendelssohn, which obviously comes from many years before. He connects, in a way, the first and the second movement is sort of seamlessly connected into each other. It's a classical, sort of a very typical concerto setup in 3 movements, sort of fast, slow, and fast, and features the horn in such a just a full range of what the instrument can do, and it's really a perfect vehicle for Ken to play with us. In planning this concert, more than a year ago, I actually approached Ken about playing a concerto, and I actually, because we knew we were going to be doing the Mozart Requiem in the second half, I initially suggested, well, how about one of the Mozart concertos? Because Mozart actually wrote 4 horn concertos. And Ken said, yeah, that's good, but what do you think about the Strauss? He said the Strauss concerto, he feels that it sort of matches his musical personality better. And I agree with that. So that's why we are bringing to you the Richard Strauss horn concerto number 1 for this particular program. So it's going to be quite a musical ride, going from contemporary Mexico to Strauss, and then all the way back to Mozart. Sort of time trip backwards a little bit in this concert, but I know you're going to love this sort of the variety of this program. So I hope you can join us for Wolfgang and Wine.